They told me my garden gnomes were a threat to neighborhood aesthetics, and fined me for each one. But when I pushed back, I found something worse than a power trip. I found a financial loophole they'd been exploiting for years. They tried to take my gnomes. I took their entire budget. It started with 7 gnomes, just 7, spaced evenly along Nate's front garden bed. Each one was about a foot tall, hand-painted, and charmingly weird. One held a fishing rod, another wore sunglasses and lounged in a ceramic lawn chair. One gnome was doing yoga. They weren't exactly subtle, but that was the point. Nate had recently finished revamping his front yard, replacing his patchy grass with drought-tolerant plants, gravel, and a few solar lights. The gnomes came last, added mostly as a joke. His niece had given him the first one for his birthday, and it snowballed from there. He thought of them as little ambassadors of chaos in an otherwise rigid HOA policed world. The gnomes lasted 5 days. On the 6th morning, Nate opened his mailbox and found a violation notice tucked inside a bright red envelope, the kind that always meant trouble. Your property is in violation of Article 5.3 of the HOA Design and Landscaping Guidelines. Decorative lawn ornaments that disrupt the visual uniformity of the neighborhood are prohibited. Immediate removal is required. A fine of $50 per non-compliant object will be assessed in 7 days if the issue is not corrected. He read it twice, then looked up at the garden. 7 gnomes, $350. That was not a joke. The notice included a photo of his garden, clearly taken from the sidewalk, with each gnome circled in red like some kind of lawn crime evidence. It was signed by the HOA Compliance Committee. A group he knew consisted mostly of 3 retirees who spent their mornings walking the block with clipboards and suspiciously intense expressions. Nate wasn't surprised they noticed, but he was surprised they cared. His gnomes weren't blocking anything. They weren't offensive. They weren't even visible from most angles unless you were deliberately looking. Still, he decided to be polite. He emailed the HOA, asking for clarification and referencing the guideline they'd cited. Nowhere in Article 5.3 was there a limit on non-permanent decorative items, and certainly no language banning gnomes. The guideline only vaguely mentioned avoidance of excessive ornamentation that detracts from neighborhood character. Excessive? 7 gnomes on a 25-foot garden bed? He argued they were balanced, clean, and well-maintained. He even attached a photo of a neighbor's flamingo-themed flower bed that had been there for years without complaint. The response came 2 days later, short, cold, and dismissive. The committee has determined your lawn ornaments are not in keeping with the visual harmony of the neighborhood. Please comply with the original directive to avoid penalties. No explanation, no negotiation, just an order. So Nate walked the neighborhood. In the space of 1 block, he counted 5 ceramic frogs, 3 metal sunflowers, a giant plastic heron, a fairy garden built into a tree stump, and a concrete goose dressed in a miniature raincoat. No citations, no red envelopes. Only his gnomes had triggered action. That night, he stood on his porch, staring out at the lineup of painted faces in his garden. The fishing gnome looked particularly unimpressed. Nate wasn't going to just roll over. He wasn't even particularly passionate about lawn decor, but he hated hypocrisy. And if the HOA wanted to fine him for 7 gnomes, he'd find out exactly where those fines were going. Nate didn't take down the gnomes. Instead, he moved them. Slightly. He spaced them out more evenly, angled them toward the street, and added a small laminated sign in front of the bed that read, "Gnome Sweet Gnome, a lawful decorative display under Article 5.3. It was petty. He knew it, but it also made a point. 2 days later, the fines began. An invoice arrived from the HOA listing a $350 charge for ongoing violation of community standards. No breakdown, no appeal instructions, just a line that said payment was due within 15 days to avoid collection action. That was the moment Nate realized this wasn't just about gnomes. He started asking around, quietly at first. A neighbor 2 doors down had received a citation the previous month for hanging a wind chime too close to the property line. Another woman across the street got fined for having a seasonal wreath with a small plastic crow on it. Inappropriate decor, according to the notice. And yet, directly across from Nate's house, one yard had a full-sized wooden ship planter, with sails. No one had ever complained. Patterns began to form. Most of the violations, almost all of them in fact, were issued to the same group of homeowners. People who'd attended board meetings and asked tough questions. People who hadn't voted for the current HOA president in the last election. People who, like Nate, had pushed back just enough to be remembered. The other group? Quiet, compliant, or directly connected to someone on the board. Their yards were overflowing with ornaments, solar lights, even fake deer, and not a single violation in sight. Nate wasn't shocked, but he was annoyed. He started attending HOA meetings, not as a participant, but as an observer. He sat in the back, took notes, and watched carefully. The president, Marjorie Kent, ran the meetings with a firm grip, quick to shut down questions, dismiss dissent, and move along any topic that wasn't on her pre-written agenda. The board discussed landscaping often, very often. And one company came up repeatedly, Green Lane Groundskeeping. They were the HOA's exclusive vendor for all landscaping and maintenance work, everything from trimming bushes to seasonal curb appeal enhancements. The board approved monthly invoices for Green Lane without discussion, sometimes multiple per month. That didn't seem unusual, until Nate looked at the numbers. Green Lane was being paid thousands every month for services that, from what Nate could see, amounted to occasional weeding and hedge trimming near the clubhouse and entrance signs. Nothing too elaborate. Nothing that explained why the HOA was spending over $40,000 a year on what looked like routine work. The next day, Nate submitted a request to view the HOA's public financial records, which, by law, had to be made available to any homeowner. He kept the request polite, formal, and entirely within his rights. The board didn't respond. He followed up. Still nothing. On the 10th day, he received a short email from the treasurer saying the records would be made available when time permits, and warning that continued distraction from board priorities may constitute harassment. That was when Nate knew he'd struck a nerve. He didn't push back. Not right away. Instead, he started building his case, screen capturing every invoice mention, photographing HOA-maintained spaces, documenting conversations with other residents who had been fined. The gnome fines were now over $500. But it wasn't about the money anymore. If they wanted to nickel and dime him over a few ceramic figurines, fine. He was going to find out exactly where those dimes were going. It didn't take long for Nate to confirm his suspicion. Green Lane Groundskeeping wasn't just overpaid. It was barely doing any of the work it was billing for. He started documenting their visits. For 2 weeks straight, he kept a log of when the trucks showed up, how long the workers stayed, and what they actually did. A few times they trimmed the hedges at the entrance. Once they blew leaves off the clubhouse walkway. Most days they didn't show up at all. And yet, in the latest meeting minutes, the board approved a $4,700 payment to Green Lane for spring landscape refresh and perimeter detailing. Whatever that meant, Nate hadn't seen it happen. So he dug deeper. The company had a bare-bones website, no customer reviews, and no social media presence. But the business license was public, and that led him to a name he recognized. Bradley Kent, Marjorie Kent's son. Technically, Bradley owned the company, but Green Lane's business address was the same as Marjorie's, her home in the neighborhood. The groundskeeping company was nothing more than a shell operation run out of a residential garage. No office, no staff, just a truck, a handful of tools, and a mother who just happened to be in charge of approving all HOA expenditures. It was subtle, clever even, Each invoice from Green Lane was under $5,000, the amount that triggered mandatory resident approval under the HOA bylaws. Spread out monthly, they flew under the radar. There were just enough vaguely worded descriptions and line items to make the payments look routine, but when Nate compiled them, a clear pattern emerged. Over the course of 12 months, the HOA had paid Green Lane just over $47,000 for minimal, often unverified work. The bulk of that money was likely going directly to Marjorie's family. He gathered everything: scanned invoices, screenshots, photos, business registration records, timestamps of landscape crew absences, and compiled it into a single folder on his desktop. Then he backed it up to the cloud. Twice. At the same time, he kept receiving notices from the HOA. The Gnome fines had now hit $650, with a threat of lien filing if left unpaid. Each new letter was more aggressive than the last. His display hadn't changed. The gnomes still sat peacefully in the garden, untouched, unmoved, a silent protest. But Nate was done playing defense. He built a simple website. Just a landing page, really. Black text on a white background. At the top, "Where did your HOA fees go?" Beneath that, a gallery of documents. Every suspicious payment, every maintenance log that didn't match reality, and a visual breakdown of how Green Lane's payouts compared to the actual work performed. He included a page for residents to submit their own HOA experiences anonymously. At the very bottom, a single closing line: "They fined me for garden gnomes. You should see what they've been doing with your money." He called it the Gnome Files. He sent the link to 3 people. That was all it took. Within 2 days, the site had spread across the entire community. Neighbors emailed it to each other. It made its way into local Facebook groups, a few Reddit threads, and eventually landed in the inbox of a local watchdog blog that loved HOA horror stories. The story wasn't about gnomes anymore. It was about fraud, favoritism, abuse of power, and it was about to explode. The fallout was immediate. The morning after the Gnome Files went semi-viral in the neighborhood, Nate woke up to a line of cars parked on his street. People were walking by his front yard, pointing at the gnomes, talking in low voices. A few stopped and took pictures, not of the gnomes, but of the sign he'd added next to them overnight. $650 in fines, $47,000 in payouts. Ask your HOA why. By noon, the HOA sent out a damage control email to all residents. It was long, defensive, and empty. They called Nate's claims incomplete, his website potentially defamatory, and insisted that all financial decisions were vetted and transparent. But they offered no evidence to counter his findings. No denial of the business connection between Marjorie Kent and Green Lane. No proof of services rendered. Worse for them, the residents weren't buying it. A wave of emails, phone calls, and public record requests flooded the HOA inbox. People who had never once attended a board meeting were suddenly quoting bylaws and demanding full financial audits. One homeowner even printed out the invoices Nate had uploaded and hand-delivered them to every house on the street with sticky notes saying, "Read this." That weekend, the HOA called an emergency meeting. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only. Nate sat near the back, not needing to speak. The documents had already spoken for him. When the meeting began, Marjorie Kent took her place at the front of the room like she always had. Composed, practiced, slightly patronizing. But this time, there was no authority behind her tone. She tried to reframe the narrative. She said the landscaping contracts were streamlined for efficiency. She denied any personal connection to Green Lane, despite the paper trail. When asked why all the contracts conveniently stayed just below the $5,000 threshold, she brushed it off as coincidence. The room didn't believe her. Then a resident stood up, one of the quieter ones, someone Nate didn't even know, and calmly asked if Marjorie could explain why her name appeared on the business registration for Green Lane's insurance policy. The room fell silent. Marjorie didn't answer. She gathered her papers and walked out. Within 48 hours, she submitted her resignation. 2 other board members followed. The HOA was now leaderless, reeling from the exposure. A temporary committee was formed to manage essential functions, and residents immediately pushed for a full audit. An independent firm was hired. In their preliminary report, they confirmed what Nate had already proven, that thousands of dollars had been spent without verification, oversight, or justification. Most of the services couldn't even be confirmed as completed. The fines against Nate were dropped without comment. The official letter didn't include an apology, just a quiet line at the bottom. All enforcement actions related to decorative lawn elements have been suspended pending bylaw review. But Nate didn't need an apology. That Monday, he went out to the garden and placed a new gnome at the center of the bed, larger than the others, holding a tiny scroll in one hand and a magnifying glass in the other, a gift from a neighbor. Someone had labeled it on the bottom, "The Auditor." The gnomes had stayed. The people who tried to silence them hadn't. The audit results were worse than anyone expected. Over the course of 3 years, the HOA had funneled nearly $130,000 into Green Lane groundskeeping and a handful of other small vendors, all connected in some way to members of the previous board. Most of the payments had been buried under vague descriptors like seasonal beautification, general upkeep, or simply miscellaneous maintenance. Invoices were sloppy. Half weren't itemized. Some had identical descriptions repeated month to month, word for word. And at least a dozen had been billed for weeks where weather reports showed storms or extreme heat, days when no landscaping crews had shown up at all. The audit firm's conclusion was blunt. The board failed to maintain transparent financial practices, violated multiple oversight protocols, and circumvented resident approval thresholds through strategic invoice structuring. In plain terms, they'd been using the HOA like a piggy bank. The report was shared with all residents. The response was swift. Legal action was filed by a group of homeowners demanding restitution. Green Lane groundskeeping dissolved within 2 weeks, and while no criminal charges followed, the fraud hadn't technically broken state laws. Civil penalties were in motion. The newly elected board wasted no time. They rewrote key sections of the HOA's bylaws. Any vendor contract above $2,000 would now require public posting and community vote. All fines would be suspended pending review. Residents could now appeal any violation through an independent committee, not the board that issued it. And the best part? Article 5.3 was amended. Lawn ornaments, gnomes included, were officially permitted as long as they didn't obstruct pathways or pose safety risks. For the first time, decorative expression had a place in the rulebook. Nate didn't say much throughout all of this. He didn't have to. The neighborhood knew what had happened. Neighbors started dropping off gnomes on his porch, one at a time, sometimes anonymously. A firefighter gnome, a DJ gnome, a gnome dressed like a judge. Within a month, his original 7 had turned into 23. Someone even donated a custom-made 4-foot-tall gnome with a briefcase and glasses. Nate placed it right at the edge of his yard, beside the sidewalk, where everyone could see it. He named it Chairman. At the next community potluck, one of the new board members raised a toast to those who stood their ground with ceramic boots planted firmly in the dirt. The laughter was real this time. Not nervous, not forced. The fear that once came with questioning the board had lifted. The HOA still existed, but now it served the community, not the other way around. And as for Nate, he'd never planned to become the guy who took on the HOA. All he wanted was to keep a few gnomes in his garden. But when they tried to make him back down, He asked the question they never expected. "Why are you really so afraid of a few gnomes?" Turns out, it wasn't about the gnomes. It was about what he'd find once he looked close enough.